It's often been said that the first steps of any journey tend to be the most significant. And at the moment I'm kind of flushed with anticipation as I prepare myself to set out along some of Scotland's roads less travelled. This year I'm in the very heart of Scotland, ahead of the Cairngorms, mountains and glens that have shaped my life. But there's much more too. Dramatic waterfalls, wild stretches of remote country, and a fascinating selection of people to meet along the way. I'll be on foot, on bike, taking to the water in my pack raft, and above all, my pride and joy, the camper van. So here's an offer. Why don't you join me on this journey of discovery? I'm particularly excited because I want to go and explore a part of Scotland that I've slowly been getting to know over the past 40 years. And as I so often do, I'll be walking with the seasons, starting early when the last snows of winter hug the hills and spring is still around the corner. I wanted to begin this journey at a significant place, so I've chosen the summit of this mountain. It's called Ben Rinnes, a mountain I like to think of as Scotland's Whisky Mountain. Ben Rinnes forms the epicentre of the Speyside whisky country. Over there is Dufftown, and it was once said that Rome was built on 7 hills, but Dufftown was built on 7 stills, and I quite believe it. It's a town that's not short of hills either, and this Ben Rinnes is probably the most prominent of them. At just under 2,500 feet, this peak dominates the skyline. And these fantastic granite towers that guard the summit remind me that this country of ours is full of surprises, and what a journey lies ahead. I'll be following the River Spey to Granton before heading to Aviemore and the northern Cairngorm Hills. Then it's west to the wild, elemental beauty of Ranachmoor. Later I'll be travelling east and south to Blairathel, Blairgowrie, and what I always think of as the vastly underrated Angus Glens. Finally, to complete this ring around the heart of Scotland, it's over to Deeside before I finish in the Cromdale Hills, which will take me back to where I began. The whole circuit is roughly 320 miles. But hey, who's counting? I come down from the high tops now to Craigellachie and Old Lady Spey. I think the River Spey is the finest river in Scotland, but you'd expect me to say that because I've lived on the banks of this river for 40 years, and in that time I've kind of got to know her idiosyncrasies, got to know her characters. The River Spey rises on Spey Loch in the mountains of Corryarroch and flows down through Strathspey all the way to Speymouth on the Moray Firth. She is in fact the fastest flowing river in Scotland. This is the lovely old Craigellachie Bridge, the oldest prefabricated cast iron bridge in Scotland. And unbelievably, until 1972, this was the main route north between Granton and Spey and Elgin. And before that, there's a ferry crossing here. I've come west for a couple of miles along the Speyside Way. One of Scotland's great trails, this long distance walk was opened in 1981, and for much of its length it follows the route of the old Speyside Railway. I've often mentioned the high regard in which I hold the old guys who built the fantastic network of stalkers paths that we have in our Highland hills and mountains. But that regard fails to insignificance when I think of the people who built our railway lines. It just seems to me that nothing got in their way, nothing prevented further progress. When they came to an embankment like this, they would just blast their way through it. Nothing would stop them. The only thing is I keep getting this feeling a train is going to appear behind me and I'll have to jump off to the side. While I'm absolutely thrilled that an old railway line like this can have a new lease of life as a long-distance walking route, I can't help being pretty regretful that the closure of a line like this has been a real lost opportunity. A train taking all the whisky casks off the road, taking a lot of diesel-powered lorries off the road, is surely the way to go in a society that wants to be green and progressive. Sadly, that's all wishful thinking, but this is an area surrounded by the echoes of the past. I'm leaving the river behind me, at least for the moment, and I'm doing what I often do, going off route to discover more about a Scotland that's vanished. I'm following a lovely road that runs between Glenfergus and Cardbridge, and it crosses a rather large elevated area known as the Dava Moor. And it's an area that's always fascinated me because it has a really wild and remote feel to it. I've driven over here countless times, but somehow failed to explore this evocative landscape on foot. It's time to put that right and find someone to help me. And there's no one better than Chris Halliday, whose roots go deep into this ground, stretching back many generations. Like so much of Highland Scotland, this place was once teeming with life.
People say it's a bleak, windswept, hostile environment, but so many people lived here. The first census here was in 1841, and the population of the Dava then was about 200. There was about 27 houses.
It's an interesting place because you don't really get a sensation of great altitude, but there are snow gates.
Usually in the winter, the first places you hear on the radio that are closed are the Lecht and the Dava. The summit's just over the 1,000-foot mark, but this exposure to the winds from all directions. This is one of the last crofts in this particular area that was inhabited, probably up until about the 1960s.
So this is well removed from the traditional black house you'd see in the Western Isles, where the cattle would share the same building as the family.
Yes.
I mean, this looks like a separate dwelling house.
So this is Cranach, which literally means the place of the trees, and there was Wester and Easter Cranach. What we're actually standing on here is where the horses used to walk round and round. You can see it's all been built up to power the thrashing machine. This roofless building here is the barn, and we'll take you inside it too because there's some quite interesting features in it, Cameron. And then if you look down it from this end, you can see the upright pieces of wood. Those are what we call couples, or in England they call crux, and they went up and were the framework to support the roof. Most of the crofts here, they had families of 4, 5 or 6 children. But kids of all ages running around here, playing, helping with the harvest. So we'll come down this way. You even got footsteps for us.
My goodness, a wee stairway.
And you also helped out your neighbours. So the people here, when their harvest was finished, they might go over to another farm. It might be a few days later their harvest, they'd all muck in, and people would help on the binder and making stooks and that sort of thing. Mind your head as you go through.
Okay. Oh, into the nettles.
This is one of the original couples that's rotting away, and you can see how clever these people were. They didn't put the wood straight into the ground, which would have rotted. There's a big stone, so it wasn't the stone that was supporting the roof, it was the wooden couples. There was a MacDonald family that lived here, quite well known for their fiddling skills as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the little community had a ceilidhs quite often and barn dances and that sort of thing. So we're coming around to the front of the house now, Cameron, and what would have been a garden, because they also grew some fruit here as well, and you'll find gooseberry bushes sometimes and black currant bushes still blooming. And the other thing to point out is there's still the rowan tree, which is to keep away the witches. Nearly every house had its rowan tree. Some had 4, so there'd be one at each corner. And if you look over there, that Christmas pudding-shaped hill over there is a sheehan, it's a fairy hill. And you hear stories about people would be digging and find a little stone arrow, which is obviously from the Stone Age or something like that. Because they didn't know what it was, it's not made of iron or copper, they thought it was a fairy arrow. And then you never touched the fairy hill, it was superstitious, you never grew anything on it, didn't interfere with it.
And woe betide if you walked on the hill and you had some pipe music from within.
Yes, because you might disappear for 100 years and never be seen off again.
I could spend days exploring here. It's a link to a way of life that has vanished. And there's one other place Chris says I must see. Dava School opened in 1878 and has been closed for over half a century. Now it's a house, but the current owners have kept many of the original features and have invited us in. So this is the old schoolroom.
The old schoolroom of the Dava School. Yeah. Teacher's desk and the fireplace and the old ruler, blackboard ruler.
Would you look at that? That's fantastic, isn't it? I remember getting smacked across the back of the legs with one of those. Do you have any idea of what this was like originally?
We do, because a lot of schools had what they call school logbooks, and these were diaries that were kept by the school teacher, just about everyday occurrences in the school. And I've got a copy here of some of the interesting entries.
Was that a copy of the original entries?
The school opened here for the first time. Present 7 boys and 5 girls, total 12. Elizabeth Margaret Coventry of Edinburgh Free Church Training College began duties here aged 20.
And what beautiful handwriting as well, isn't it? So what else have you got there? That's fascinating.
Just a small sample, Cameron. We know how bad the weather was in the winters, and this is a record of it, as you know, from the day it actually happened. So the 14th of January 1879. Owing to the very stormy weather and impassable state of the roads, the children have been unable to meet since December the 16th. So that's a whole month.
Oh, that's not a bad holiday.
Hence our schoolwork has been very much retarded. 15 children were present today. We're very much dependent on nature here and the seasons. So if you take your time and absorb the atmosphere and the places and the history, you get far more of a sense of what the Dava was.
One thing's for sure, I won't be driving over the Dava again without stopping to explore more of it. Although this area is full of the past, for one scientist it's an open-air research laboratory. Faye Jackson is a hydroclimatologist who has coordinated a project investigating the temperature of our rivers. And what's happening in the Spey enables us to understand far more about our environment and how to protect it. It's a world first.
We're right at the start of a really fantastic resource, and one of the outputs will be a model that can allow us to make predictions of river temperature for any location on any day of the year across Scotland.
How do you actually get the temperature of the river? I have this vision of you wading into the Spey with a thermometer.
We use these, called a tiny tag. What it is a little computer and a thermometer, and recording temperature every 15 minutes. This logger will log for 339 days and 17 hours before it becomes full. The temperature of the river is really important for all manner of life, but of particular importance is salmonid species like Atlantic salmon and brown trout that are cold water adapted. So we want to understand why and how it is that temperatures are changing so that we can better manage rivers and fisheries into the future.
So if a river is at a particular temperature, how do you actually go about changing the temperature of it?
One of the main ways is by planting trees. We want to look at the characteristics of the river, so say what elevation is the river at, how much woodland is on the banks of the rivers, what orientation is it flowing in, how big an upstream catchment area does it have, how big is the river itself, how wide is it, how much volume of water it is. And all of these factors we can use to generate a relationship between that factor and water temperature. And by doing that, that allows us to make predictions for any location in Scotland. And then you can begin deciding, well, where would be best for us to plant? Where might change the most under climate change?
I mean, the Spey must be quite an interesting river to do this kind of work because it is fed so much by snow meltwater. So there must be a huge variation in temperature in a river like this.
One of my most recent papers was looking at the summer weekly maximum temperatures, and I predicted that for across the River Spey, and I've actually got it with me. You can see that at the top of the headwaters we're getting warmer temperatures. Some headwater streams may be really quite wide and quite shallow, and when you've got rivers that are quite wide and shallow, they heat up. But then you can see that some of these rivers feeding off the kind of Cairngorm Mountains are much cooler. And again, we can see these higher temperatures at the mouth of the river.
So that must be very satisfying for you.
Yeah, I feel incredibly privileged. I've worked with some fantastic scientists, great fisheries managers, been out and spoken to local gillies and factors, and it's been a really rewarding process, and it's great to think that the research that we're undertaking is applied and can be used, and that's, for me, really satisfying.
Would it be an exaggeration to say Scotland was a world leader in this work?
As far as I am aware, the Scotland River Temperature Monitoring Network is the first strategically designed national river temperature monitoring network in the world.
I've come upriver a few miles into what many people would consider to be the very heart of the Cairngorms National Park. This is the biggest national park we have in the UK by far. It's massive, and the main swell of the Cairngorms that rise just behind me here lead up to areas of the largest tracts of land in the UK, over 2,000 feet, over 3,000 feet and over 4,000 feet. And indeed the swell of the Cairngorms here is all sub-Arctic territory. At the moment I'm in the Craigellachie National Nature Reserve, and it's a northern offshoot of the main Cairngorm area. Behind me is the holiday resort of Aviemore. I lived in Aviemore for about 5 years, and it was always wonderful to come into this nature reserve and have a bit of a respite from the tourist throb. And you don't have to travel all that far before you just become more aware of the bird song and the wind and the birch trees here. All of this land around me is the hereditary home of the Clan Grant. And it's quite interesting that the name Craigellachie features in the Clan Grant's war cry, "Stand fast, Craigellachie." And I kind of quite like the notion of Grant warriors going into battle and shouting that out and evoking the image of their homeland, perhaps giving them something worthwhile to fight for, perhaps something to die for. And I have this image in my mind's eye of 200 or 300 kilted warriors running down the slope here, waving their broadswords, shouting out, "Stand fast, Craigellachie!" It can be pretty scary. The Cairngorms form such a significant landmass in the heart of Scotland that I thought the best thing to do is bring you up to a number of viewpoints. This is the view from the north, looking out across the River Spey, across the great forests of Rothiemurchus and Glenmore, up towards the northern corries of Cairngorm itself. As you can see, it's still pretty Arctic looking, and I can guarantee that the cold blasts that are coming down from there are very cold indeed. During the late 70s and early 80s, I was warden of the Aviemore Youth Hostel. I don't think a day went by when I didn't actually come into the reserve and have a wander around here, usually with my 2 dogs and my 2 young sons. Now, one of these curious coincidences of life, I became the volunteer warden for this Craigellachie Nature Reserve. And the main warden at that time was a man who became a very close friend and a great inspiration right until his death a couple of years ago. His name was Dick Balhary, and he was, I reckon, one of Scotland's finest naturalists.
Although Dick held a number of important posts, including chair of the National Trust for Scotland, he was always happiest in our wild places. I learnt so much from him when he was warden here. Our last journey together was for one of these programmes when we met in the Torridon Hills. Then, as he always did, he opened my eyes to the natural world.
Oh, come on, we've got to look at this. Very, very beautiful lichens.
Wow,
Look at that.
All this coloration, that's lichen.
Every one of them, the brown, that bluey, the grey, it's a different one there, and the yellow. And to think that we can learn so much from aging those, going right back to the Ice Age.
Really?
Every time I come here, you know you're going to learn something new. Under every stone, what's the beetle that just crossed the road in front of you? What's that butterfly? What's that moth? It just goes on, and that's the wonder of the natural world. Because regardless of how long you've been doing this or where you've been doing it, there's always so much more that we can learn in the short time that we're on this earth.
And I'll keep that thought in mind as I continue on my journey.
I've taken a wee diversion this morning into one of my favourite Highland glens. It's a place that's inspired poets and artists and royalty. Glen Feshie in recent years has become an exemplar of progressive conservation. I'm going to meet Thomas MacDonnell from Kincraig, and some would say that he is the inspiration behind what's happening here today.
Thomas MacDonnell was an engineer and fencing contractor before he became an ecologist. He's someone who shares the vision of the late Dick Balharry, and as Glen Feshie's Director of Conservation and Forestry, is able to put them into practice.
If you look behind us there, you can see that the junipers are starting to appear. There's a pine up the top there.
Yes.
There's a rowan right on the skyline. This woodland is starting to really sprint up the hills.
How interested you use the word sprinting up the hillsides, because there is a general feeling that to do this sort of regeneration work, it takes decades or if not centuries.
We managed to double the range of the Caledonian pine forest in 7 years. So we went from 700 hectares to over 1,400 hectares. So as we are looking here, I know it's little signs that you might not be tuned into, but these junipers, those pines starting to move up the hill, and they're all the way up to 2,500 foot. And for me, that's just the start of it. So here we have a little rowan tree starting to emerge out of the heather canopy, poised to just make its explosion into the woodland environment. The perceived way to grow woodland in the past has been to put a fence round. So you've got an agricultural almost density of herbivores outside, and you prevent all browsing within the woodland. Therefore you create these kind of blocks that we can see in the distance where the woodland is too thick and the edge is unnatural. Some people have criticised us in the past of being anti-deer, but we're not, and not at all. We just believe at the moment the herbivores, the deer, red deer numbers have been too high. This is the reason why we've got 250-year-old trees, natural. We've got trees that were planted in the 70s, so 40 years old, and absolutely nothing else in between apart from what I can show you is now emerging.
Thomas, I mean, you've obviously got a real vision for what's happening here, but how did that vision begin?
Maybe 20 years ago when I was a fencing contractor, I was over in a northwest estate fencing deer out of the last remaining bit of shelter that they had round a lodge in a Caledonian pine wood. And I remember thinking then, there's something not quite right here. It was almost the injustice of it. There we have our largest mammal, the prestigious stag, been reduced to nothing more than a migrant. I suppose I thought a little bit of the clearances in a way, what happened to my own ancestors, and thinking that these magnificent beasts they were actually to the stage that we had to chase the last few stags out of this wood before we closed the fence off. And there was stags lying dead round about. It was a pitiful sight.
So we're up quite high now, Thomas, well above 2,000 feet, and we're on this very nice wind-clipped heath. Now, surely you would expect trees to grow in this sort of terrain.
We're quite right, Cameron. This is an area which is a harsh environment. That's why the heather is what we call wind-clipped. It hasn't been able to grow the way that we saw down in the valley. But nonetheless, I believe that possibly in a larger timescale, maybe 100 years, without overgrazing, you would see certain forms of woodland. They will be the dwarf species. But more interestingly, from this vantage point, we're looking down into Gaiac here, the Bran. That river should actually have a term which is called riparian woodland. It should be fringed with trees, alder, etc. predominantly. So the woodland would expand up these little valleys all the way around the watercourses and back down into Glen Feshie itself.
I like this notion of kind of joining up with rivers that are coming up from other valleys, so that you would hope in the future you could have a situation where you could have a squirrel, for example, travelling up through the trees from the foot of Glentromie, right up here to the Brian, and then over the watershed and right down the Feshie.
The term for that is translocation, things being able to move. And in actual fact, over here to the east, where we're looking at the Feshie down into Mar Lodge, That very woodland corridor, we've got 50% of the Lecking carper population in this part of Strathspey Bay. But wouldn't it be fantastic if we could link it to the Aberdeenshire area and then start to get a little bit of I dare say a mix in the gene pool wouldn't be a bad thing. But no, these are all the benefits that we could see in the future by just having a bit of imagination.
Saying we're up here, can I just ask you, Thomas, how you feel looking at that sort of view and realising that you're the person responsible for all of that?
I find it a great honour, but also a responsibility. There's not many of their descendants from the tribal clan system who have had an opportunity to influence what happens on their own doorstep where I was brought up and somewhere that I'm very passionate about. It's almost a unique opportunity for someone like me to be in this position.
One of the reasons I'm so fond of the Cairngorms is that the summit slopes tend to roll down into these skirts of Caledonian pine forests. And whether you're climbing the tops from Speyside or Deeside, to walk up to the hill through these streets of the pines makes it a real kind of genuine Cairngorm mountain day. They're magnificent species. And you know, when the sun comes out and it hits the bark of these trees, it turns them blood red and it releases a resin that makes the air like wine. And you walk through and drink and drink and drink till you're drunk on the joy of living. What a lovely wander that was, up through the woods of Inverfeshie and Inchriach. I'm kind of staggering with the joy of it still. I'm basically following the course of a burn called the Alt Ruya, the red burn, and I'm heading for a big head wall in front of me. It's the head wall of the Scourins Ridge. And the Scourins runs down from the Great Moss, the Moyne Moor. And the hill I'm heading for today is Scourgae. It's a Munro, but it's not the most popular of the Munros. But I want to take you there because I did promise I'll show you some of the different aspects and character of these wonderful mountains. My only slight worry is that Scourgae is the peak of the winds, and today it might well just live up to its name. I'm a great advocate of what we call the long walk-in. You get a much more holistic experience of the mountain. Having climbed the Munros 3 times, I tend not to go to the actual summit all that often. I think I've maybe matured, and I kind of like the feeling of being on the mountain. And that doesn't necessarily mean getting to the top and touching a cairn. It's the being there that becomes more important to me. As were a lot of my feelings in the Cairngorms when I was first introduced to them. The feeling on Scourgae the first time I climbed it was one of fear. I kind of learned the hill apprenticeship in the west, where the mountains are big and pointy. And suddenly I was in this environment with wide, wide open skies and a sense of isolation and a realisation that the weather here could cripple you. The weather could make not only the difference between a good and a bad day, but between life and death.
And that's certainly true right now. Sadly, my earlier fears of Scourgae living up to its name have come true. It's gusting well over 60 miles an hour and getting worse. It's time to head back down the hill. So today the final score is Scourgae 1, roads less travelled, and Team McNeish 0. This year I've celebrated 40 years of living in the Cairngorms. When I first came here it was the hills that attracted me, but as time goes by I've learned to explore places in new and different ways, and that's been a revelation.
I'm on the outskirts of Kingussie, on the banks of a very youthful River Spey. Now, it's hard to avoid the influence of this river in this part of the world, and today I hope to get to know it that little bit better by getting a wee bit closer to it. I'm going to be in the company of a man who probably knows this river better than anyone else alive.
David Craig has a lifetime's experience on this river. He's paddled down it thousands of times, but each journey is special.
People say to me, how many other rivers do I paddle? And I say, are there other rivers? Spey is never boring. Every day she is different. You've got the adrenaline in the rapids, but at the same time you've got the slow pools and time to reflect as well. It offers so much.
Today David is in his Canadian canoe. As for me, well, I'm in my expensive inflatable bathtub, or to use the technical term, pack raft.
I'm just hoping he's going to manage to keep up today. Apart from his age, and he's actually in a flat-bottom boat that's going to move slower than mine. But I love him so much, I'll wait for him. He looks a bit like a gnome. It looks like something you'd find inside your garden pond, but I've too much respect to say that to him loudly.
What was your first experience of the River Spey? I know it's going back a long, long time.
It is a long, long time, Cameron. Thank you for that. Yeah. I was brought up in Stonehaven, which is a great place to be a child, and we used to paddle on a Dee a lot. And I think the Dee is a fantastic river, but in about 1964 I was brought to the Spey. And the Spey for me was just completely different, and I probably fell in love with the Spey at that stage.
Did it have an immediate impact on you?
Yeah, absolutely. It almost has a majesty that I don't think you get on other rivers. She's got a real beauty, but she's got a great sense of humour. She likes to play tricks on you, and she doesn't always make your journey on the Spey easy.
So she can be feisty?
She can be feisty, yeah.
When the water's flat calm like this, and there's not a breath of wind, and you're paddling through quite quietly, and it's really quite serene, it's the perfect antidote to working 9 to 5, 5 days a week, I'll tell you.
I can think of worse things we're doing today, Cameron. Here we are meandering away down through the Inch Marshes, and you've got this wonderful weather, and that view of the Cairngorms from here is just fantastic.
We call them Inch Marshes today, but not that long ago they were known as Inch Meadows.
It is a wetland, so I think that's maybe where the marshes have come from. And now it is quite wet in various areas and quite large expanses. But there was a time, I mean, when you look now, you've got these are actually man-made or person-made banks because they did cultivate and use this area as meadows, so they were actually growing crops and grazing animals.
I mean, essentially it's a big floodplain, isn't it?
Big floodplain, yes. I mean, if you think Loch Inch was created by a big plug of ice, it's basically an ice plug that's made Loch Inch we were heading for, and then this is an extension of that. And of course this whole area is called Badenoch, and you'll be aware that Badenoch actually means the flooded lands. So this is Loch Inch, and one of the other things about Loch Inch that is quite rare in some ways is that it's such a deep loch that they actually have some Arctic char in here. Very prehistoric fish, like deep pools. There's also several pairs of ospreys, I think, nesting in this area, but probably the best known ones are the ones that are on Tom Dhu, the island at the far end of the loch here. It's not actually a natural island. During the World War II, there were some Italian prisoners of war who were, I think, housed up Glenfeshie, and they were given little jobs to do. And so they ended up being asked to go and dig a channel on the kind of east side of the peninsula there at Tom Dhu, and they made it into an island.
I don't know about you, Dave, but I'm ready for a brew.
Well, I can provide that, Cameron. I can almost carry the kitchen sink in here.
Oh, I'm glad I brought you along.
Well, I knew there must be some reason.
Hey, excellent.
The eagle has landed. Okay, Cameron, so I'll get my kitchen sink out, and we'll have a wee cup of tea.
Good man.
Or whatever you like.
A cup of tea is fine, but after all that paddling, I think I deserve something better.
I think you'll enjoy this, actually. This is from your local distillery.
Yes, it's probably the closest distillery to where I live.
It's the closest to where you live, and it's also the closest distillery to the source of the Spey. My father had an expression which was, if you had a nice dram like this, he'd say, "round your heart like a hairy worm." Which I always think just means it's this lovely,
Yeah, the
warm,
lovely warm glow.
fuzzy feeling
Yeah.
around your heart.
I like it.
Slàinte mhath.
Slàinte mhath.
Right,
And
you're
thanks for a
staying.
great day.
No, you're very welcome.
It's always hard to leave a place that has quite literally shaped my life. But now it's time to move on. I'm heading west, going some 30 miles across the country to the tiny settlement of Tullach near Roy Bridge. Here I'm leaving my camper van behind and heading south to that remote landscape around Carúr and Loch Rannoch. Finally, as a fitting finale to this first part of my journey, there's a fantastic Corbett, Benachwolach, I want to revisit.
I've come to the highest railway station in the UK at 1,350 feet above sea level. Now it's about a dozen miles to the nearest road, so I've taken the easy option and come by train. Last year I cycled through the flow country of Caithness and I was overwhelmed by the remote, stark majesty of the place. It's similar here on the very edge of the Rannoch Moor. It's wild and it's grand and it's open, but it's all under these great domed skies. It's absolutely terrific. Shortly I'm going to cycle over the hills to Rannoch Station, but before I do that, there's a wee place down by Loch Ossian that I'm quite keen to reacquaint myself with.
Loch Ossian Youth Hostel is one of the most remote in the country. It opened in the 1930s and you can only get here by train, foot or bike.
I haven't been here for some years and it hasn't changed a bit. The last time I was here I had been asked to reopen the refurbished youth hostel, and at the time it was the first eco youth hostel in Scotland. So it'll be interesting to see how much it's changed inside.
To run this place you have to like peace and quiet, and that suits the current warden, Jan Robinson, who's been here for many years.
Hi
Cameron.
The old place is
Nice
looking
to
pretty
see
good
you.
still. It's fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you know, it's 14 years since I've been here.
Well, I think it's probably changed quite a lot since you were last here, because we've got electricity now.
Oh,
We're getting
no.
the hydro from the estate.
That's not as romantic as it was though.
I know. It used to be very basic.
Yeah.
And I used to like that because when you're totally reliant on a turbine and solar panels, people are really aware of when they can have electricity and when they can't. Now we've got effectively mains electricity, even though it's super green, you can just turn it on and off and not really have to think about it.
So we're in the kitchen. What is this we've got here? Is it a range or is it a wood burning stove? Or is it
It's
both?
a kind of mixed fuel burning stove. I light it every evening because of the ambience and also because it heats the hot water. So I'm glad we've still got that. There's 2 dormitories, one 12 bed and one 8 bed. I don't know if you remember all of that.
Yeah.
So this is the ladies' dorm, the 8 bed,
Yeah.
which actually has the best views. And then
Super.
we've got through here, we've got the showers now, which is one of the new things that came with the electricity. It means that people can come and stay a bit longer. People don't really like staying without being able to have a shower. And the number of people who are happy to go and jump in the loch is kind of,
It's shrinking.
it's shrinking,
Yeah.
I think. It is quite cold in there. But some people still do.
Okay, toilets. Outside toilets. Yeah.
The loos, what we call long drop composting.
I like that term, the
Long drop
composting.
composting. It's kind of scary. I say to people sometimes, don't look down. But of course they do.
Of course, as soon as you say that, they'll do
No,
it.
I shouldn't say it actually.
And do these compost toilets, do they need any maintenance?
Well, they have to have sawdust put on them. They're very rustic, but actually they're quite expensive. And it's good not only for the hostel guests, but it's also great because a lot of people who are walking and mountaineering and bothying and the Duke of Edinburgh kids, I don't want to go on waxing lyrical about what a social gift these toilets are, but it's good to
They're
have
quite
such a
important.
thing.
But of course the most fantastic facility you have here is the location. There's not another hostel like it.
It's just so gorgeous.
Yeah.
And then you've got all these Munros. I think one of the really precious things about this hostel is that you can't drive here. And the eco things that we've got here, I think it's good. A lot of that in the cities is hidden, whereas here that's very direct. If you're going to put something disgusting down the sink, where's it going to go? Eventually it's going to go into the mouth of a fish.
Do you take a lot of satisfaction from your job, and particularly when people come here who are maybe not used to this sort of environment?
Really, this place does for itself, and people's excitement and exhilaration is coming from the place. When they come off the hill from a fabulous day, people are so busy and delighted. And I hear them saying to each other, I haven't seen a soul all day. There is something really precious about that these days, and that's really lovely.
It was lovely to see Loch Ossian Youth Hostel again. And you know, I could have chatted to Jan for hours, but the journey goes on and up. I'm heading for Rannoch Station, and I've got several miles of undulating off-road in front of me, although at this point it seems to be undulating upwards. Oh hum. Some of you might remember the old song, by Loch Tummel and Loch Rannoch and Loch Aber I will go. It's the song of the road to the Isles, and I'm now on that legendary road to the Isles, except I've turned my back on the islands and I'm heading out towards Highland Perthshire. But it's a fantastic high-level road that follows this fringe of the Rannoch Moor. And looking across today to this great mattress of moorland with a grey glowering sky hanging above it, just as though it's going to plunge down and turn it into a desolate wilderness. It's so atmospheric, I just love it. And the road is just enticing me along there, little rise after rise after rise. And I know eventually I'm going to hit that final rise, and after that I'll have a big long downhill into Rannoch. Can't wait. When you look at that, is that not a bonny view? Oh wow. This is why I was so keen on riding my bike across this old road to the Isles, for views like this, because you just get that bit of height above this great bare mattress of the Rannoch Moor. And right in the middle of this great big saucer, the great Blackwater Reservoir, with the hills of Glencoe rising just to the left of it. They've got some rain cloud on them now, so I've been really lucky that these glowering skies have glowered over that way. Ever since I was a wee boy, I've had a real fascination for the Rannoch Moor. And I remember in my late teens, an old pal of mine and I decided we were going to canoe across the moor. So we left our old car that we had at the time in a lay-by, took a double-seater kayak and canoed down Loch Ba and then a wee bit of river into Loch Leyden and right across to Rannoch Moor, and we were absolutely delighted with ourselves. But what we hadn't taken into account was the wind that was blowing, a bit like today, that had been so friendly and pushing us across the loch became our foe as we turned round to go back to the 882, and it was a real struggle canoeing into the waves and the wind. And by the time we got to our car, we were on the very edge of hypothermia. And it really made us aware of what a serious place the Rannoch Moor was, and still is, even today. I can see Rannoch Station just way over yonder at the head of Loch Leyden. And when I was at Loch Ossian Youth Hostel, Jan happened to mention to me that she thought there was a ceilidh on at the tea rooms at the station tonight. I'm tempted to go and check it out.
When Rannoch Station was built at the end of the 19th century, the tracks had to be floated on a bed of tree roots, earth and ash to prevent them sinking into the bog. This railway was a triumph of engineering, but it was built with the blood and sweat of countless men, some of whom paid for it with their lives.
If you look at guidebooks around, Rannoch Station, bleak will probably be the words that you'll see, but it certainly doesn't feel like that to me, and I think people visiting nowadays wouldn't use that word anymore.
Bill Anderson runs the tea rooms at the station, but it's far more than a place to eat and drink. For many people, it's their community centre, hosting everything from poetry readings to ceilidhs.
People love this area, they love the station, and the fact we've got a rather beautiful building, it works really well as a place to run music events. And we had some concerts last year with people sort of properly seated at concerts, and we have pub nights, and yeah, we try and get a real good atmosphere going. Welcome everybody, and it's wonderful to have you here in Rannoch, Party Town Rannoch. Have a wonderful evening. And if we can kick it off with our pipers, Bobby and Dusty, who are going to play a number. Thank you all.
Try and support Bill in that quite a lot. I mean, I lived in Newcastle for 25, 28 years, and my social life is better up here. It's every week there's something happening.
The point about a ceilidh is that everyone joins in, me included. Although I wonder what the passengers on the 1838 to Glasgow make of all this.
A lot of you will know this song, Come By the Hills. I think for anybody who climbs the hills of Scotland, this is a great wee song. Oh, come by the hills to the land where fancy is free. Stand where the peaks meet the sky and the lochs meet the sea, where the rivers run.
Oh, it's wonderful. There's nothing like live music. Everybody loves live music. Everybody responds to, and it's traditional music. It's none of your pop stuff. This will be proper Scottish stuff. Maybe a few Irish ones chucked in for fun. No, I love it.
Oh, come by the hills to the land where life is a song.
My attitude is, when you're playing, you're not performing, you're entertaining. We can all get up and sing boring songs or songs that are lovely and we've got to listen. But the way you get fun out of the audience is to sing songs that they enjoy, they can sing along with the choruses, and really get involved in it.
So this day is done. Woo! Well done, everyone.
Live music is just the best thing ever, and everyone should get out and do it. And that's when we started doing ukulele. It's such an easy instrument to get people started. We do the Highland Perthshire Ukulele Club, and we have people there that have never done music before, and they come along and they do their music on a Monday night. It's the best night of the week, they said. They just love it.
I did a solo gig here. There was even the train stopped, and it was the interval, and we went outside with the odd glass of wine, as you do, and the people couldn't believe what was happening. There are all these people out on the platform with glasses of wine, and they're looking from the train. Does this go on all the time? Oh yes.
Now summer blinks on Fleury Braes, and o'er the crystal streamlets plays.
Life without music, I couldn't really want to contemplate it. Any kind of music, but making it together is special.
Well, what a great night that was. It's left me with a bit of a creaky voice this morning, but I think a good bike ride in the fresh air will do me the world of good. It's a kind of grey and dour morning and the midges are biting, but once I got on the bike, it'll be fine. I'm heading back to the road to the Isles again, and that's going to take me down the south shore of Loch Rannoch. So lots to look forward to. I've come off the road for a few moments to explore this ruin here. It's called Dorn na Innis, and it's a former cattle drover stance. You know, it's extraordinary to think that in the days before the railway, this road to the Isles was the route to the north of Scotland. And as such, it was very popular with cattle drovers who would bring their great herds of black kye along the south side of Loch Rannoch and down to the great cattle markets at Falkirk and Crieff. And there would be these little steadings where they could stop for the night. And if you could imagine, it would be a fairly low-roofed, smoky place, probably with lots of dogs running about. I've been quite keen to visit this place because although I've been following cattle drove roads for, I don't know, it just seems like decades, this is the first time I've actually seen a proper stance. This is the real McCoy. This area of Rannoch is as rich in folktale and legend as any other area in Scotland. And one of my favourite tales has to do with this loch, Loch Eagach. It's said to have once been the home of a kelpie, a water horse, and it would beguile young children. It would kind of snuggle up to them and nuzzle them. And they were so enchanted by this water horse that they would jump on its back, and then with its nostrils flared, it would dive into the loch and plunge down into the depths with the children clinging onto its back. It would then devour the children, and it says their entrails would float to the surface. But it's not all grisly gloom and doom. One day a cattle drover was returning to his home in the Blackwood of Rannoch when he saw something glistening in the undergrowth, and he found a horse's bridle. But the unusual thing was the bit on this bridle was red hot. So he took it to an old Cailleach, an old woman who lived in the village, and he said, "But why is that bit so hot?" And she says, "It's because it was forged in the underworld." But she says, "Keep it in the cleft of a rowan tree and your fortunes will change." And from that day on he prospered. Not only that, but his children prospered too. I thought I would dump the bike, bring myself down to the shores of Loch Rannoch and enjoy the peace for a few minutes. It's an impressive loch, you know, it's 10 miles long and it's got a recorded depth of 440 feet. So who knows what you'd find in those depths.
This is a landscape with as many faces as the weather, and all of them have something to offer.
I'm approaching the end of the first part of my journey around the heart of Scotland. And I have to confess, while I really enjoy my cycling these days, this is where my heart lies, really, in the hills and mountains of Scotland. This is a hill called Benahulach, and it rises above Kinloch Rannoch. And I first climbed this hill in 1968 as a teenager, and a somewhat reluctant teenager, I have to say. I'd been training hard all winter for the Scottish Junior Long Jump Championships, and I was dragged up here as a police cadet on a 2-week summer camp, just a week before the National Championships. And I was convinced that all this hill walking and canoeing and rock climbing would ruin my chances of winning the long jump. As it was, I won, so it didn't really affect me too much. Some of you might recognise the big hill behind me here. That's Schiehallion, and it very much dominates the whole Rannoch area. It's a fascinating mountain, and it was once used in an experiment to try and calculate the density of the Earth. The scientist behind it was the astronomer general of the time, one Neville Maskelyne. And in the course of that experiment, they actually discovered that you can join up places of equal height on a map, and that became known as contour lines, which of course today is invaluable for we hill walkers. The hill I'm climbing is not a Munro like Schiehallion, it's a Corbett, and I doubt if we'll meet anybody else on this hill, where on Schiehallion I reckon there'll be at least a few dozen people. Wow, what a view! And I'm looking right across Glengarry, and beyond that, these glaciated looking hills are the hills of the Gaelic Deer Forest, where I was with Thomas MacDonnell just a few days ago. But I'm not going that way, I'm going this way, up to the summit of our mountain here. It doesn't look so far now. The summit of Ben O'Hoolish forms the apex of 5 distinct ridges that radiate out into all different directions, and it really gives the hill this rather nice character. 2 of those ridges, the ones that flow down to the south, terminate in truncated spurs, quite craggy areas called Craigvar and Craigvui, and they've been formed by a great glacier flowing down 10,000 years ago from the Rannoch Moor and just cutting the edge of these 2 ridges. But that's away below me, and I've just got a wee climb now, a wee steep climb up to the summit of this hill, which rises to almost Munro height, not quite Munro height, 892 metres. 914 metres would make it a Munro, so it's a Corbett. Ben O'Hoolish. And thank goodness for the size of this cairn, because it's given me a wee bit of shelter from the wind. Well, this brings me to the end of the first part of our roads less travelled around the heart of Scotland. And I'm looking away into the distance there at my route ahead. But before I get there, I've got to get off the hill, grab my bike, cycle along Rannoch Side to Rannoch Station, where my bike and I are going to get on board a train back to Tulloch Station, where I'll be reacquainted with my camper van, and hopefully catch up with you somewhere in the hills north of Pitlochry. So join me again, please, for the second part of Roads Less Travelled around the heart of Scotland.
And you can join Cameron at the same time again tomorrow on BBC Two Scotland.
Welcome to the second part of my journey round the heart of Scotland. I'm going to be visiting some fascinating places that are rich in legend, folklore and culture. The kind of places you find on Scotland's roads less travelled.
And I might finally have met my match. I can't believe I ever thought it was a good idea to bike up one of our notorious snow roads, the Cairnmount.
I could walk up this hill faster than ride it.
And I was more than a little scared about taking to the air in a plane with no engine. But just look at this bird's eye view of our landscape.
That feels so weird. You suddenly think we're on our own.
Back at ground level, I'm exploring some wonderful hills.
Oh, I feel as though I'm on top of the world.
So stay with me, because there's so much to discover as I travel through what I believe to be some of the finest landscapes you'll find anywhere in the world. It's been a fantastic journey so far, from mountain top to fast-flowing river, and all through a part of Scotland that has quite literally shaped my life. And in the years I've explored our hills and glens, there's one thing I've learned. You don't have to go far off the beaten track to find somewhere special.
You know, it's amazing to think that less than a mile from here there are hundreds, if not thousands of people in cars and buses and coaches and caravans and motorbikes trundling the way up and down the A9, getting hot and tired and agitated. And if it took just a few moments, they could be here, the perfect place to be. I'm just 11 miles north of Pitlochry at a place called Brewer. Not far above me lie the vast plateaus, moors and hills of the Athol Deer Forest. And after periods of heavy rain, those great acreages just soak up all the water like a gargantuan sponge. Unseen forces then push the water up through the surface into a series of bubbling streams. One of them flows fairly sedately down the length of Glen Brewer and then suddenly, chameleon-like, changes character. These Brewer Falls have attracted all kinds of visitors over the past 250 years. Queen Victoria visited, as did William Wordsworth, the poet, and William Turner, the artist. But it was William Gilpin who first suggested there might be something not quite right. He said that although the falls were dramatic, there should be some kind of accompaniment. Now in 1787, our own bard Robert Burns came, and he put his finger right on the problem. You see, at that time the falls came through this naked gorge. There were no trees here. And Burns felt that although it was quite spectacular, it could be really special. So he did what he did best. He wrote a poem to the landowner, the Duke of Athol. It was an 11-verse poem, and contained within those verses were these words: "For wad my royal master please, he'd grant my highest wishes. He'd shade my banks with towering trees and bonny spreading bushes." The words of the ploughman poet had a dramatic effect. The Duke of Athol immediately acquiesced to the petition and set forth on a huge programme of tree planting. So much so that this part of Highland Perthshire is known to many people today as Big Tree Country.
And it's a big journey I've undertaken this year. Over 300 miles and a huge circuit around the Cairngorms. From Benrinnes I made my way westward through Speyside and onto the Rannochmoor. Now I'm heading to the most southerly point of my trip, Blairgowrie, and then onto the Angus Glens. Finally, completing my ring around the heart of Scotland, I'll visit Deeside before finishing on the Cromdale Hills, an almost perfect circle. I've always loved being on the move, and I'm heading south to the glens around Blairgowrie. Today I do this for pleasure, but even in a recent past this was a way of life for tinkers or travelling folk who pass through these places. They're such an important but often neglected part of our history and culture.
There has always been a group of itinerant tradespeople, but I think that it was highlighted after Culloden, because in the whole clan system, which completely broke down, all of the positions in the retinue of the chief, the bard, the filly, the medical man or woman, the piper, the clarter, the armourer, they were all outlawed or banned. It was perhaps a natural progression. They would travel from place to place just trying to make a living.
Dr. Margaret Bennett has spent her professional life as a folklorist, recording and writing Scottish traditions. In that time, she became close friends with many of the travelling people and their descendants.
The big attractions was seeing so many people that you hadn't seen for maybe the year before, especially at nights. And they would always have a massive fire. And the men would stand around heating themselves and talking and arguing and fighting, and the kids were playing. And there was always women coming out with like big kettles of tea, and you just helped yourself. That was just amazing. I loved that more than anything else.
So what was it that brought the travelling people to this particular part of Scotland?
I would say this.
The berries?
The berries. That's what brought not just travelling people, but so many other people from all over Scotland, all over the islands, to earn money during the summer.
So I hadn't realised there's a lot of non-travellers worked in the berry fields as well.
I think non-travellers, country handlers we call them, probably became travellers for the couple of weeks that they got off on holiday, and they could have a free life, back to nature, back to doing what they wanted to do rather than be restricted in a house or a job that didn't give them the freedom. And there was always lots of songs, lots of stories.
What was this compulsion to move, to travel? Is this something that's inherent in the travelling person?
It was maybe in their genes in certain ways, but also they needed to earn money.
I wonder though, Ian, is there not an element where the traveller in general doesn't want to be under the thumb of a master?
Yeah.
They've maybe in some distant past had enough of that, and to commit to a job that was 300 and whatever days a year in the one place, and it could be a drudgery, then go on to something you do like.
Yes.
Or you went busking then?
Went busking or pearl fishing. Pearl fishing was good because you couldn't really do it in the winter because the rivers were frozen or they were in spate like they are today. But the rest of the year, yeah, pearl fishing was a big, big part of the travelling lifestyle that I miss so much.
Berry picking, tatty picking, gathering whelps, busking. The travellers went where the work was. But I had no idea that included pearl fishing. It's now banned, but in a stream without freshwater pearl mussels, Ian showed me the techniques that were passed down through generations of travelling families.
I can see the bottom there. I can actually see the bottom. It's obviously not clear, but I would see that if there was a shell there, I would just go in like this and then hook the shell and lift up again, you know. It's now a worldwide ban on it because people who did not know how to fish were just opening the shells at will, opening and killing the mussels, just so many, thousands of shells. Whereas the travelling folk, they got to know that you didn't have to kill the shell to find pearls. They would look for shells that had markings, a misshaped shell, which they called a crook, where it was twisted, which the pearl had caused as it was growing. So they would say, okay, well, we'll keep that one and maybe put the rest in. Normally marking them to make sure that people lifting them again would say, oh, they're no good, and leave them in.
There's one final place Ian wants me to see. The place that provided employment for the travelling folk during the harsh winter months.
Me and my mum worked at Keith Bank Mill. I was only like 15 at the time as an apprentice mechanic, and my mum worked upstairs in the actual weaving or the spinning. You started at 6 in the morning and I had to come down the steps down to actually where the wheel was, where the laid water went into the wheel. In the winter there was lots of snow and ice and I had to stand there for a couple of hours breaking this up, and I froze to death, but I thought I was a man. I was like 15.
It's a factory really, and it's darned hard work, and the hours are long, but there was a steady wage, and it meant that they could stay in the town, the children could go to school, which was required, and then when the berry season came, or actually potato planting or another agricultural part they like to do outdoors, the mill bosses would say that's fine, because they valued their work enough and more to say, okay, for that duration, out of the mill and into the fields.
How sad are you that that way of life is gone?
Very sad indeed, of course. I grew up with it. It's gone now, and you can never recreate it. You can just enjoy the memories.
And I'll take those memories with me as I head out into the Angus Glens. Glens that local people love but deserve to be better known. I'm starting out in Glenprosden.
I'm keen to take you on a favourite ridge walk of mine, but before we do that, there's something kind of special I want to show you. The first time I came here, I was amazed to discover this wonderful monument to the polar explorer Robert Falcon Scott and his chief scientific officer, Edward Adrian Wilson. These two men planned their Terra Nova expedition of 1912 to the South Pole in a cottage just below the monument here. Sadly, both of them died on that fateful expedition, and they were beaten to their objective of the South Pole by only 33 days by a Norwegian team. The very fact that they planned their expedition here in the Angus Glens makes this a very fitting memorial to them. Well, I'm almost at the start of my ridge walk, and we start off with another memorial. This is the Airlie Memorial Tower, and it's dedicated to David Ogilvie, the 9th Earl of Airlie. And he died at the Battle of Diamond Hill in Pretoria in South Africa during the Boer War. And this was erected in his memory in 1901. I have to confess, I much prefer the Scott Wilson Memorial, tucked away as it is in a corner of Glen Prosen. I find this a wee bit ostentatious. Towers like this, it's as though they're erected to try and dominate the landscape. I've come on this wee ridge walk because it's a nice introduction to this area known as the Angus Glens. It's a ridge walk that goes between two of the most prominent of the glens, Glen Prosen on one side and Glen Clover on the other. And I really like to think of the Angus Glens as fingers from a hand radiating out from this hub that is Kirriemuir, reaching out into the higher Grampians. And later on I'm going to tell you about another Angus Glen, a rather personal one. This whole landscape has been created by the Ice Age. Great glaciers would have ground their way down here, creating these classic U-shaped valleys. And likewise, these beautiful sculpted corries that are such a feature of Glen Clover in particular. And sometimes it's nice to see these big hills from a distant perspective, because it gives you a greater appreciation of the whole landscape as an entity. When I first visited the Angus Glens, I was in my early 20s and living in Aberdeen at the time, and I was really eager to explore what I considered to be the high tops of the Eastern Highlands. But when I first came here, it was a wee bit like dropping out of the world into the Angus Glens. It was very different to all the other mountain areas I had explored. Most of my hill-going buddies at the time had never been to the Angus Glens, and most of the people that I met in Angus Glens walking had never been anywhere else. So it was that kind of place. I remember getting to know people like the amazing Sid Scroggie from Dundee. Sid was a blind, one-legged poet come mountaineer who haunted these glens. And most memorable of all, the other Angus Glen that I mentioned earlier, the one and only Davy Glen. Davy was a gangrel extraordinaire. He was a hugely accomplished hill walker and mountaineer, a well-respected mountain rescuer, a great builder of bothies and dossies. In fact, there's one of his dossies still well used on Jocks Road high up above Glendall. It's known to this day as Davy's Burach. And I often think that when God made Davy Glen, he threw away the mould. The Angus Glens are a lot quieter without them.
Someone else whose name is intrinsically linked to these glens is Steve Byrne. Steve was born and brought up in Arbroath and is a founder member of the folk group Malinky. He suggested we meet in Glenesk because its history and folklore underpin much of his work.
As we're standing here in the shadow of the Hill of the Rowan, just thinking of Robert the Bruce, who allegedly in 1306 had fought John Comyn, the Earl of Buchan. All of those threads just play through some of the stories of the Glen that we heard growing up, and there's wee bits and pieces that you can find, whether they're true or not, that's part of the magic of the Glen.
And of course you're an Arbroath man, Steve, born and bred, and Arbroath is of course the home of the Great Declaration.
Indeed, 6th of April 1320, that's the date that is ingrained in my mind. Really it was just Scotland's declaration of independence at that time when there was the various wars between the kings. They were asserting Scotland's nationhood, you might say.
And this declaration had worldwide importance because we believe the American Constitution was largely based on this declaration.
True, there are aspects of it that certainly would have been carried in people that had gone from Scotland that would have had a knowledge about it. You know, in the 1700s and 1800s, they would have been aware of that in the sort of romantic era of celebrating Scottish history. And I suppose in European terms, if not world terms, it's one of the earliest assertions or declarations of that kind of national identity.
Steve's fascinated by all aspects of our history and our landscape, and the more local that is, the better.
I've always felt from my childhood interested and curious about where I grew up and the things that surround me, whether it's the names of the trees or the names of the places of the lochs or the birds or whatever. I just think it's important for people to feel comfortable in their own skin as well as their own landscape. That's something that in all the work that I do, we try and work on this principle of dig where you stand, and that's really about learning from the ground up, looking around you rather than always looking up to sort of higher culture.
And one song that epitomises this sense of place for Steve is The Wild Geese. It was written in 1915 by the Angus poet Violet Jacob.
She put it in a collection that was asking to be sung called Songs of Angus, and there's the line about the Angus braes you hinna trod for years, and I always think of Glenesk whenever I sing that. And far up in the Angus straths I saw the wild geese flee, at lang, lang skein o' beaten wings, with their heads towards the sea, and I their crying voices trailed, a hint them on the air. Oh, wind, hae mercy, and had ye wished, but I darna listen mair.
Lovely. It's a song of exile, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And for me, it's very much about Angus. I'm a wee bit possessive about it, as some people know. Far up in the Angus straths, I saw the wild geese flee. Lang, lang skein o' beaten wings, with their heads towards the sea. So it's very much the sound of home.
How important is it for you to keep these old songs alive? Some people maybe think, you know, we should really move on.
Well, if you move on, where are you moving on from and where are you moving on to? The idea of a sense of place, which is a well-worn term these days, I think is still valid and uppermost in my mind in most things that I do. There's a song I've been teaching to some of the kids in Angus that is about a mill in Arbroath, and because it's a building that's really ken speckle in the town, everybody knows what it is, and the kids are amazed that there's a song about it. So we're coming away from that traditional attitude of wheeling out the Scottish songs when it's Burns night or St Andrews night to really the local song level, because I think that is the way that we're going to make communities more cohesive and people more confident in their own local culture. And it's just about saying however you speak is a valid means of expression, and I think nobody should be in a position to tell you otherwise.
Steve, we've come up to the head of the glen here by Loch Lee. What does this place mean to you?
I suppose it would be the pinnacle of the walks that we would often take as a family. And we'd always look forward to coming to the old kirkyard here at Loch Lee because of the poet Alexander Ross of Loch Lee. He's buried here, he was a schoolmaster here, and that's always been a bit of a touchstone for me. And there's quite a few poems and bits of songs and things to do with him specifically, as well as to do with the place. He was born in 1699 and he basically gave poetic voice to the glen.
Was he well known in his own day?
I think so. Burns thought very highly of him, and yeah, just the work that he's done was pretty well known amongst sort of fellow poets at the time.
It seems to be the sort of place that there should be songs written about.
Indeed, you can certainly see from the landscape why it would have inspired somebody like Alexander Ross to put pen to paper. It's always been a bit of a place that had a bit of magic about it as well. It's quite an inspiring place.
You know, I've listened to Steve singing his Songs of Angus all day long. What a treat that was. And I'd have quite liked to explore some of the other Angus glens, but for the moment I'm going to put the kettle on, have a cup of something before I continue on my journey. I think I have to start preparing myself mentally, because the next part of my journey is going to be much more physically demanding than my walk with Steve. And I have this funny feeling that it's going to be a bit of a blow to my self-esteem. So Cameron's ego, prepare to be battered.
Just along the road from here, there's a massive hill that has a fearsome reputation for anyone on a bike. It's the Cairnlough Mount. As a keen cyclist, I have to give it a go. But I'm not going to be on my own. Markus Stitz is originally from Germany, and he loves these roads. Unfortunately, Markus is considerably younger and fitter than me. He's also considerably more experienced. Last year he completed a lifetime's ambition, pedalling over 34,000 kilometres on and off-road right around the world.
I read a book and there was a guy cycling from London to Christchurch in New Zealand. And I thought, like, I'd really like to do something like this. And then at some stage I thought, like, if I don't do it now, in my mid-30s, then I would possibly never do it again. I didn't want it to become this idea which will always be an idea, but you never do it, and thought, like, this is it.
What were you doing at that time? I mean, were you settled in a career?
Yeah, before I set off I worked as head of marketing for Scottish Swimming. So I got to work on the London Olympic Games, I worked on the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, which was a pretty amazing thing to do. But it was also then, having worked at those events, I think it was the right time in my life to say, in my profession, in my career, I've reached a level where I'm very, very confident about making a change now, do something else. Heading around the world is heading into the big unknown. I didn't know what to expect cycling across the US. I didn't know what to expect cycling across Australia or New Zealand. I literally set off in Edinburgh having a rough route in my head. I knew where I wanted to go, roughly the countries, but anything in between, that wasn't planned, and there was sometimes even done on a daily basis.
This is it, Markus. This is the start of the uphill climb, all the way to the top. 16%.
It is pretty steep, 16%.
If that's an upper scale for you, goodness knows what it's going to be for me.
So, this is it. But at least I've got lots of gears to help me up the hill. Markus is on a single speed bike. It's the one he used for his round the world trip, so he did the whole journey on just one gear. He's a man who loves to keep things simple.
I'm not aware of that someone's done it on a single speed bike. Having just one gear made it, it's exactly that little spark. But also the simplicity of it. We invent things, we make technologies for everything. And in real terms, it should really make our lives easier, which it does if you use it properly. But I think people use technology nowadays, they're just putting more and more things on their plate. And looking back at the trip, exactly that simplicity made it the more enjoyable.
My definition of adventure is always a journey where the outcome is not certain. And in this case, the outcome is certainly not certain. I could walk up this hill faster than ride it. Give me a pair of trekking poles and a rucksack in my back and I'd waltz up here. Woo. Come on, Markus, give me some tips for riding up hills.
I guess it's different on the geared bike. So on a single speed, if it gets too steep, you try zigzagging like this. Because you'll take a little bit of momentum over. The nice thing about going uphill is that you go at a much slower pace than if you go down or on the flats. Whenever there were mountains in the countries I was in, I tried to take the route through the mountains instead of on the flat bits.
On a year-long journey, there are bound to be some low points. What was the most dangerous circumstances you were in?
I think dangerous, not much. I guess I felt at some places uncomfortable, and that comes from, I think, wherever you go to, those countries have different habits, different cultures, people do things in a different way. In Southeast Asia, for example, where people naturally touch everything on the bike and sometimes even touch you because you are this tall person who looks different, and it's just their way of doing things. I also found that once you acclimatize to that, that's actually where the real experience starts in the country.
Having seen Marcus ride up this hill and been out of his saddle most of the way, pumping away at his single speed, I was going to say it leaves me breathless, and it has to a certain extent. But to think of him doing that for every day for well nigh on a year, in all sorts of weather conditions, and with a bike that was fully loaded, I think is really quite extraordinary.
It's a good thing sometimes about not knowing to know where you are at the top. Like in France, if you cycle up the mountain passes, they're really gradual. I think the longest I have is 30 kilometers going uphill.
That's Marcus off into the distance again. This climb is less than 4 kilometres, but it's beaten me.
Just that last bit going round, when it steepens, going round the bend, on the apex of the bend it seemed to go vertical. Oh, I thought I'd gap it though.
I tried to slow down going up the hill just to give you a little bit of encouragement. 2, 3.
Oh, it sounds easy to say it at the time. For a race. Oh, Cairnmount. Fantastic. Great, Marcus, well done. Oh, and this is what I'm looking forward to, the big long downhill. This will be the best part of the day, I think. Are you up for it?
I am.
Yeah, come on then, let's do it.
That's better. A long downhill is what makes this biking look so worthwhile. My circuit around the Cairngorms now takes me over to Banchory, from where I'll head west up Deeside. Then have a short diversion into Glenmick for an ascent of a fine Corbett, Connacraig. And finally it's over the high roads again to my ultimate destination on the Cromdale Hills. But first, there's one place I really must visit.
I'm taking a wee walk this morning up a hill that's been a well-loved landmark amongst Aberdonians for generations. It's called Clachnaben. It's an interesting hill because it's a final defiant gesture of the rolling Grampians before they're swallowed up by the vastness of the Fetteresso forest and the coastal farmlands of Aberdeenshire. Without wanting to turn this programme into a poetry appreciation show, I really have to tell you about a little rhyming couplet that suggests that Clachnaben was not only popular amongst generations of Aberdonians, but was quite important to sailors. It says, Clachnaben and Benachie are twa landmarks frae the sea. It's good, isn't it? There's also an old Scottish folk song that hints that past winters here were pretty dreich and dismal affairs. It says, Cairnmount lies bleak and bare, and cold lies Clachnaben. Well, it's not cold today, it's a wee bit windy, but it's actually a cracking day, and I'm going to make the most of it. "20 years ago I was invited to come here and officially open what was then a new footpath up Clachnaben. An old friend of mine, Jim Mason from Forfar, had become quite depressed at the state of the path here. It was very muddy, badly eroded, so he formed what he called the Clachnaben Footpath Trust and managed to raise £200,000. I have to say, 20 years on, the path is in excellent condition. In fact, it's probably in much better condition 20 years on than I am. But it just shows what one man's vision and steely determination can actually achieve. This big granite tor here dominates the summit of Clachnaben. And I'll bet you anything, if that tor didn't exist, people wouldn't climb this mountain. It'd just be like any of the other hills around here, nicely rounded, nothing special. But you can see that granite pimple from miles and miles around. These granite tors are a fairly common feature of the Cairngorms and Grampians. They're made of hard granite, and the land round about them is a much softer rock. And over the thousands and millions of years, the weather, the frost, the rain, the wind has worn away that land, that softer rock round about, but the hard granite stays intact. And I think when I get up there, there's a couple of little scrambling routes up to the summit that I think I might enjoy. You will have noticed that I'm coming up the easy way and not the steep side, which is the dark side. My rock climbing skills have diminished with age, I'm afraid. I think I'll leave my poles down here. They just get in the way when you want to use your hands. Lovely rough Cairngorm granite. Wonderful stuff for rock climbing on. Oh wow, you know, when you've got a point that is so dominant and you can see it for miles and miles around, then you know that when you get up to that point, you're going to get a great view. And this doesn't disappoint at all. It's absolutely fantastic. I can see the North Sea across there, and over there, I can just make out some of the buildings in the city of Aberdeen, would you believe? Morven, let me turn around. The high tops of the Cairngorms away across there. Mount Keene, and away over there, the Angus Glens. Oh, I feel as though I'm on top of the world.
The views from Clachnaben are outstanding, but there's one way you can get an even better sense of these mountains, and I'm going to try it.
I'm about to do something I've never done before, something I'm not sure I've ever wanted to do before, but I'm very, very keen to see the landscape from a different perspective, from on high. So I've come to Deeside Gliding Club, and I'm about to go up, up and away in a glider. With a bit of luck, I'll see you later.
Support yourself on these metal pieces of structure here.
Okay.
Stand on the chair and lower yourself in as if it's a bathtub.
Okay, go for a bath.
I'm taken to the air with one of Deeside Gliding Club's most experienced instructors, David Innes.
Can you move the rudder pedals by your please?
Yeah.
Even so, my fingers, toes and everything else are firmly crossed.
People come here in September, October, primarily to go really, really high. In September last year, we had 20 gliders on the same day, up above 20,000 feet. It was absolutely amazing.
The front of the aircraft is just in front of my toes, and there's not a lot of space to either side, so you do feel you're in something that is quite minimalist. And to be in something like this at 10,000 feet, or 15,000 feet, or 20,000 feet must be quite extraordinary.
I'd rather be inside than outside.
I think that's fair comment.
And we're off.
Okay, and we're off.
David, you were a hill walker. You got all the benefits of being up high, but your feet were firmly on the ground.
Absolutely.
What made you go flying?
I had a trial flight and I really enjoyed it, but I discovered I could get a different but similar experience. I could enjoy the scenery, but I could see a lot more of the scenery and have a very different perspective which you could never see in the ground. Releasing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
That feels so weird, it really does. I took a gulp there, suddenly I think we're on our own. So what are you looking for now? Now that we're released, we're on our own, what is it you're looking for?
I'm looking for some rising air, but I'm also looking for any visual clues such as birds soaring, any clouds forming overhead us. There's nothing at the moment because it's not that sort of day. I feel a bit of a surge there, but I'm not seeing any rising air to match it. We'll just keep on. Oh, there's a bit something here. You can interpret the rising air currents and stay airborne just like a seagull or a hawk would do, with no engine, and fly for hundreds of miles, literally with only the power of nature keeping you airborne. That's a marvellous feeling. Some days you may not go fly very far, but you're staying airborne when you don't think it would be possible. So we're in a hint of rising air here, and there's a bit more here, so I'm just going to turn us gently in. When you feel that sort of rocking disturbance, you know, you must be getting close to it. And this is basically what birds do instinctively, but what we as humans have to learn.
You know, it's an extraordinary experience being away up here in comparative quiet.
Absolutely.
Because when you're flying commercial airplanes, you're aware of the noise all the time.
Indeed.
But there's a little bit of wind noise.
Yes.
We're flying along quite gently. Beautiful views all around us. And all the time this awareness that you're not being propelled by any kind of engine.
Exactly. Well, we're being propelled by gravity and rising air. You know, gravity is pulling us down all the time, and the rising air pushes it back up occasionally.
Yeah. Give me an idea how far you can travel in a day.
The top people in our club have flown over 500 kilometres in one day. Daylight is your limitation. People quite often have had 10-hour flights from here.
I find that absolutely remarkable. You can fly that sort of distance without an engine.
If you're using the air currents, if there's positive air currents, you know where to find them, and you can stay in them for long enough, then you will do it. Basically, the glider is like an aerial toboggan. It's always going downhill through the air. But if the air is rising faster than it's going down, you're going to climb. Anyway, we're about to land. See, we're looking down on the landing area, the runway's clear. What I'm trying to do is set up the brakes so that white yellow line remains at a constant aspect. Holding off, whoop, bit of a gust there, holding off, whoops, another gust there. I just let gently down, dink, and we're there.
Hey, well done.
Still alive.
There we go, that was something else. I'll tell you though, the feeling of being away up there at 3,000 feet, seeing not only the immediate landscape, but away far into the high Cairngorms, absolutely fantastic. But all the time knowing that there's no propulsion, there's no jet engine or anything else. It's just, as David kept telling me, the uprising warm air and the wind, and it's absolutely amazing. You feel like a bird. The only question I have left is, how can I get one of these in my camper van? Well, what a wonderful experience that was, seeing the Deeside landscapes from 3,000 feet up in the air. But you know, I'm quite pleased to get my feet back in terra firma. This is really where I belong. I come a few miles west of Ballater to a glen that I'm immensely fond of, Glen Mick. And from here it's always a great temptation to nip up Loch Nagar. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to climb one of its neighbours, a smaller neighbour called Connachraig. It's a lovely wee hill. It rises to 865 metres above sea level. It's got 3 summits. All going well, it gives you some fantastic views of its much more illustrious neighbour, the dark and frowning glories of Loch Nagar. But I'm not walking on my own today. I've been joined by one of the founders of a website that's become a vital tool for anybody wanting to explore Scotland's hills and wild places. Helen, you started Walk Highlands, 10 years ago. What were you hoping to achieve?
We'd always been really keen on walking, full stop. We moved to Scotland and just wanted to be able to share that with people, maybe give something back a little bit. It's just like creating a massive guidebook for the web, but with all the bells and whistles that you can get with the internet.
And you have created a giant guidebook. I mean, you've got literally dozens and dozens and dozens of routes all over Scotland. Do you go out and walk all these routes and record them yourself?
Yes, pretty much. When we started out, we had a couple of other people doing some of the walks for us, but that's been the fun bit primarily for us. And it's taken us to every corner of Scotland. You know, I have crawled into caves, gone round lochs and lochans that I'd never heard of. It's mind-blowing how much there is on our own doorstep.
Have you got a route on your website to Connachraig?
Yes, it doesn't go the route we're following here because this is the route to Loch Nagar, so we try not to duplicate too much. I'm hoping for a decent view at the top.
It's not looking great, Helen. I think the weather's going to stay dark and frowning.
Atmospheric, I think.
Before starting the website, Helen and her partner Paul had regular jobs. But like many people we meet on the Adventure Show, they decided to follow their dream. And 15 years ago tramped 4,000 miles right across Europe. A year later, their lives were changed forever.
It was an amazing experience. On foot, you see the details, don't you? Going into towns, but you're going past the municipal dump or, you know, the place where the teenagers hang out, and you just see a different side of things. And I think it was that really that made me think I want to explore my own country more on foot. Starting out in Scotland, you think, well, there's everything here as well.
I think we're just approaching the path junction.
Yeah, that cairn marks the route to Loch na Gar.
And our path should be about here. Yeah.
We'll get the view, hopefully, of Loch na Gar when we get up there in about half an hour.
Optimistic than I am.
Here's hoping.
So how experienced had you been taking a big journey? Had you done much of that sort of thing before?
No, not really. I'd done weekend backpacks. We were living in York at the time, so we would spend our evenings walking around with a full rucksack to try and get fit, you know. It's the flattest place in Britain, really. But it was straightforward. You just get your kit down to the minimum in terms of weight and off you go.
Did you camp most of the time or did you stay in B&Bs?
We camped most of the time and that was fine for the summer months. Some of the winter time in Italy and northern Greece, it was pretty cold, you know, talking like -10, -15.
Most people work 5 days a week and they maybe have 2 days a week free, and maybe one of those days they can go and climb a hill. Can you still get that same benefit?
I'm absolutely sure you can, and I don't think you need to be up a hill. You can just be out there in the countryside somewhere. Just look down at your feet and you see a beetle or something. And there's that connection somehow. You see something else living and you feel your place in the world. I think that's all it takes. So you can do that in your local park.
How difficult was it to finish?
It was easy right at the end because, you know, we ran into the sea and it was all, you know, some Belgian tourists took our photo and it was all lovely, and I was thinking, great, I can ditch the walking boots and that sort of thing. And it was very, very quickly. After the initial excitement, you just thought, I want to be back out there. And I would go and carry on at a drop of a hat.
Yay, made it to the summit. Dark and frowning, I think describes it well. Helen, if, God forbid, for any reason you couldn't get to the summit of a hill again, how big a loss would that be to you?
I'm not so tied to the hills. I'm not someone that has to get up something. But to be able to get outside, I would need to be able to get outside into the Scottish countryside, no doubt about it.
And that's certainly a sentiment I share, and one that gets more precious with the passing years.
Before I head off to my final destination near Tomintoul, it suddenly struck me that this summer has been one of the wettest summers Scotland's had for a long, long time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means our rivers will be high, which means that our waterfalls, our gorges and linns can be quite spectacular. The Brewer Falls were absolutely terrific. I know another place, not very far from here, that I think can be equally spectacular. I wanted to share with you what is one of my favourite places in the whole of the Cairngorms. This is where the water of Coich flows down fairly sedately down its glen, and then suddenly in one mad, extravagant dance gathers itself before forming a cataract through the very narrow gorge to the Linn of Coich before it goes down and enters the River Dee. It's a wonderful place, it's a noisy place, there's lots of action going on. And above all of this rise these silent pine trees, these stately Caledonian pines, rising from this rich undergrowth of blaeberry and crowberry. And on warm summer days you get this intoxicating scent from that undergrowth that mixes with the smell of pine resin from the trees. And it just sets you off with a kind of natural high. It pervades all the senses, you know, the sound and the smell and the sight of it all. It's fantastic. But that's not all. If you follow me, I want to show you something else here. Here we are. This is what I want to show you. I think it's great. This is the Earl of Mar's punch bowl. And tradition has it that in the weeks leading up to the first Jacobite uprising in 1715, the Earl supporters would gather here and pour into that hole what they described as anchors of potent aqua vitae, basically hooch whisky. And they would dip their mugs in there and raise toasts to the Jacobite cause. It's a lovely story. I think it's fair to say most people come to the Cairngorms because of the big rounded Arctic hills and plateaus. But the Cairngorms are surrounded by some of the finest glens you'll find in the country. They're magnificent, they're unspoiled. Glens of beautiful Caledonian pine trees and tumbling rivers like this one and the heather slopes of the big mountains. Over the years, I've explored many of these glens, sometimes over days. And it's a nice thought for me that when the day comes and I can't actually get to the high tops anymore, I can still continue to explore these glens. And I'll come back time and again and again and again and again. Well, we're on the road again, and it's a lovely big stretch of high ground here to cross. And I love these wide open moors and these great big sullen skies. What I want to do is look for somewhere to pull in for a wee while. I've got this notion, I want to give myself a bit of an afternoon treat. And normally, you know, when I'm looking for somewhere to stop for the night in the camper van, I would use a campsite. But most campsites in Scotland tend to close round about the end of September, so that's when I would stealth camp. But I'd be very careful it was somewhere that it wasn't going to disturb people. And normally I'd arrive there in the dark, I'd spend the night there, and then I'd be off before it gets light. Nobody would have the slightest idea we'd spent the night there. It's the same ethic as a wild camper. Earlier on when we stopped at Glencoich, I found some chanterelles, nature's bounty, you can't beat it. And I thought, what an opportunity to have a bit of toast and fry out some of these. This is what I mean by a real treat for myself. Oh, wow. The lovely thing about the camper van is you can stop wherever you want at the side of the road if you feel like a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Or as I'm doing this afternoon, just a little bit of afternoon tea and toast with some fresh mushrooms. How does that sound? There we go, heaven on a plate. Well, let's see how it tastes. Here we go. Oh, that's scrummy. I'm almost at the end of my roads less travelled journey around the heart of Scotland. And I find myself back on Speyside, the epicentre of whisky distilling country. Now, I hope you've noticed that throughout this journey, barely a drop of the hard stuff has passed my lips. But with a bit of luck today, that's going to change.
Today, whisky distilling is one of our most important industries, but from medieval times until the early years of the 19th century, most of these stills in this area were illegal. In fact, there were something like 200 of them in Speyside alone. I've met up with master distiller Alan Winchester, and my obvious first question, why were there so many?
Following the colonies becoming the United States of America, the country was looking for some money, so Pitt introduced taxation on spirits. It forced the industry underground.
Did each family have its own stills?
They must have, to have that amount of distilleries supported. Also, the product was widely known, so we expect that the farmers, crofters, all had a still and all played their part. We know that illicitly distilling was a part of the farming cycle, but it increased in importance because this was a difficult place to police. Remember, there was still a bit of the Jacobite rebellious spirit around here, so anything that would cock a snoot to the ruling government was probably carried out here. There was legal whisky, but it wasn't good quality. And it showed how bad the legislation was, that when the first ruling monarch, since the 1745 rebellion, came to Edinburgh, he asked for the real Glenlivet. He was asking for something that was illicit.
The other side of the coin, of course, is the gaugers. I assume because this was a remote area, it wouldn't have been that easy to get here.
The nearest excisemen would be in the larger villages, so it was a day's trip to get here. They didn't have a lot of time to go wandering about. They maybe saw the smoke running, but remember, the local folk would have spotted strangers in the glen, and that message would be passed around very quickly. So you had a bit of time to run up the hill, hide your worm, hide your anchor of whisky, and return to your pastoral occupation.
And look all innocent.
Yes, oh I never saw anything here.
It's all right talking about the illicit trade, but most importantly, what did the final result taste like? And exactly how did they do it?
That would originally have been a peat fire or juniper?
Juniper. I've heard that the juniper, when dry, doesn't burn with any smoke, because we would have been sending the message, the smoke signals to the excise, there's a still working. The pot you would have used for heating your water for your mashing process. We've riveted the head, but that was caulked with oatmeal as a paste, and then the head, because remember, that's a pan, but that's a distillation equipment. So run off with that, break it up. So, well, that's a copper pan. They'd have to prove that. The copper worm's an important thing.
So, Sam, this bit here, is that what you call the worm?
That's the worm, copper tube, bent into that shape. Very easy to do. Nice gentle heat. You see there's some, but it's still cool. So, alcohol boils at a lower point in water. The vapour's conducted over the swan neck or lye pipe into the worm, which cools it back into a liquid.
And I notice we've actually got something coming out.
A nice
that pipe there.
A nice rat tail. So it tells
Is that called
you
a rat tail?
It's the size of a rat tail.
It's lovely and clear.
Nice legs in it.
What do you mean by that?
Essential oils. You see how the oils flow down the glass?
Yeah.
Because it's not a neutral alcohol. It's full of flavour. Knows it neat.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
We'll add some water. And this is how we test the spirit, because the final arbiter is your nose. Nice?
There is that floral bouquet too, isn't there? It's not bad at all. It's all right, yeah. I expected something pretty foul.
No.
But that's actually quite drinkable.
Slangewa.
Grand.
It's one we made ourselves today.
It may be homemade, but I'm not complaining. That was great. The last day of my roads less travelled is always bittersweet, but I have a wonderful finale as I return to the hills.
I'm just about to complete the circle on this long journey around the heart of Scotland. I'm on a range of hills called the Cromdale Hills, and they rise above Speyside, and they culminate in the highest point, a hill called Craigen-na-Haish. And from there, I hope to get a great view of the hill where I started this journey, Ben Rinnes. But for the moment, it's fantastic to look behind me and just look into the swell of my hills of home, my beloved Cairngorms. I guess there aren't too many regular hill walkers who'll be familiar with the Cromdale Hills. And I suspect a lot more people will have heard of the Hawes of Cromdale. It's the title of a song that was written in the 18th century to commemorate one of the early skirmishes in the first Jacobite uprising. It was written in 1690 when a band of Highlanders ran up against the Dragoon forces, the government forces under the command of Sir Thomas Livingstone. They met just round the corner here below me on the Hawes of Cromdale. It was a pretty one-sided battle according to historians, and fortunately for the Highlanders, halfway through the battle, when they were losing large numbers, a mist rolled down from these hills and the battle was abandoned. Most of the Highlanders ran off them. They fled over these hills into the safety of Strathdon.
But it's really interesting how the Jacobite propaganda people of the time wrote a song that turned the result of the battle on its head and suggested it was a great victory for the Jacobites. There's some lines towards the end of the song that says, "Of 20,000 Cromwell's men, 1,000 fled to Aberdeen. The rest of them lie on the plain, they're on the halls of Cromdale." And when I hear that song sung today, it makes me give a little wry smile, because it just shows that, political spin is certainly not a new concept. I'm really enjoying this. You know, although I'm not technically in the Cairngorms, it kind of feels as though I'm in the Cairngorms. The feeling is one of openness, big wide skies, blue skies today, just this whole sense of spaciousness. And best of all, I haven't seen another person all day. I'm completely on my own. The very last thing I expected on these hills was a steep, rocky and scrambly summit finish. But it's nice granite rock. It's lovely. Well, here we are, Craignachaist, 722 metres above sea level and the highest of the Cromdale Hills. And of course that brings me to the end point of this year's Roads Less Travelled. I've virtually completed the circle of this journey around the heart of Scotland. I can almost reach out and touch Ben Rinnes across there, which was my starting point. For me, it's been another fabulous journey. And the lovely thing about using a camper van is I can carry my hiking gear, my mountain bike on my pack raft, so I can choose the activities. I was just thrilled to be able to cycle down over the edge of Rannochmoor. And of course, the day on the Spey with David Craig, just paddling down there in sunshine, was quite idyllic and will stay in my memory for a long, long time. We've had some great walks, both low level and high level, and of course being in Scotland in all kinds of weathers. So it's been fantastic. For next year, well, I have something very special in mind for next year. So until then, enjoy your hills.